forth. There are books in the back, Stuart from our bookstore, Union Bookstore, has book copies in the back if you wish to purchase a book. But meanwhile, let me thank Dean Kevin Averitt for agreeing to host this and make the opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. It's far from agreeing to host it. It's delighted to host it. There are a few things more happy, more felicitous to play the host to than a book launch. There are a few things, but book launch is right up there. And particularly this book, Peacebuilding Through Dialogue, Education, Human Transformation, and Conflict Resolution. It is my pleasure to have worked with some of the folks who have contributed to this and to support in my own way the work of the Ikeda Center. We have a full program, we have a very distinguished panel, so let me jump right into it. I do want to introduce the panelists to you. Each will talk about themes in the book. There are several themes in the book, themes that to which dialogue relates, and we will hear about that. Of course, I wouldn't be a proper academic if I didn't say, and the themes interpenetrate and they all relate and they're all parts of the same. But there are distinct themes, and you should hear about all of them. Let me, as I said, briefly introduce our panelists. Let me start with Mark. Mark Farr is president of the International Institute for Sustained Dialogue, and in this capacity he carries on the work of the late and lamented Hal Saunders. The Institute seeks to reverse the polarization of our civil space and build bridges across our public landscape. Mark has had more than 25 years' experience in political and public service in the U.S. and in the United Kingdom. In his previous role as president of the National Vision and Public Engagement, which was part of the Institute for Faith and Service, he drew on teamwork, insight, civic skills, and I dare say dialogue from corporate, faith, nonprofit, and other sectors to develop a dynamic new curriculum. So Mark is also an educator for an emerging generation of America's leaders. And there's more, but I do want to be... Yeah, okay. Okay. Peter Stearns needs no introduction, at least to me. Peter came to George Mason as provost in 2000 and served in that role through 2014. And he was named a university professor in 2011, taught previously at Harvard, the University of Chicago, Rutgers, Carnegie Mellon. During Peter's tenure as provost, Mason more than tripled its level of funded research and tripled its number of doctoral programs. One of his key accomplishments to me was the establishment of a teaching center now named after Peter to parallel the establishment of an undergraduate research program and several new disciplinary missions. Peter has stood for, he then returned to the faculty, I should say. People talk about stepping down as dean or stepping down as provost. That makes no sense to me. Peter ascended back up to the faculty where he's been teaching in the history and art history department. Among many books that Peter has published, and I know the number has become something tiresome for you to hear in some sense, but among the many, many books that Peter has published, I want to note three. One is Peace in World History, published in 2014, Tolerance in World History, and Gender in World History. There are others, but those to me are key ones, crucial ones for his editorship and for our engagement here. The other thing to say more personally, both as a longtime colleague of Peter's, that Peter has stood for steadfastly the role, the position, the stature of the liberal arts in what has become a great research university. And for that, I think you certainly deserve the thanks of all of your colleagues. Susan Allen needs no introduction to me, at least. Susan directs the Center for Peacemaking and Practice at Mason. She is a scholar, practitioner, almost an ideal type of a scholar practitioner. Her main focus is on reflective practice and research that emerges from practice context. And that's really the key notion, both the practice and as a reflective practitioner, the research that emerges from it. She's had substantial experience in intermediary roles and coordination among intermediaries with evaluation of conflict initiatives and with theories of change. Susan joined the ICAR core faculty in 2005 after teaching at the American University, and she was also at the Carter Center for many, many years. Susan is truly one of the anchors for practice here at SCAR, and one of the people who keep the notion of what makes SCAR special alive every day. We have other panelists. As long as we're doing this, let me introduce Kevin Mayer. Why don't you stand for a second so the camera can see you? And he's the program director for the Ikeda Center, and in this role, he leads the program team in developing events and publications. An old friend, Mitch Bogan, who is the Ikeda Center Publications Associate, and we'll be hearing from them, I hope, as well. So let me now turn it over to the panel.
That would be then Kevin and Mitch. Yes. Thank you, Kevin.
So good afternoon, and welcome to today's launch for Peacebuilding through Dialogue. And I really want to thank Susan Allen and Kevin Averick and the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution for hosting and organizing today's gathering. Thank you as well to our esteemed panelists, including Susan Kevin, as well as Peter Stearns and Mark Farr for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to your presentations as well as a dialogue to follow. So it's been an incredible honor and pleasure for the Ikeda Center to partner with George Mason University Press on this book project, which has taken about 2 years to complete. And thank you so much, Aaron and Emily from George Mason University Press, for all your support and for publishing this book. I'm pleased to open today's dialogue with a brief introduction of the work and mission of the Ikeda Center before inviting my colleague, Mitch Bogan, to share some reflections on the new book. So our center, which was established in 1993, is located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're very close to another well-known university. And our mission is to build cultures of peace through learning and dialogue. Our philosophical foundation is the Buddhist humanism, inspired by the work of center founder Daisaku Ikeda, who is a Buddhist thinker and leader, peace builder, educator, author, proponent, and practitioner of wide-ranging dialogue. Mr. Ikeda's dialogue partners have included Arnold Toynbee, Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, Linus Pauling, and other influential figures in the worldwide shift to a culture of peace and mutual understanding. Many of these dialogues have been published in book form, including 10 that our center published under our publishing arm, Dialogue Path Press. In addition, every year since 1983, Mr. Ikeda has published a peace proposal which explores the interrelation between core Buddhist concepts and the diverse challenges global society faces in the effort to realize peace and human security. In addition, he has made proposals touching on issues such as education reform, the environment, the United Nations, and nuclear abolition. One of the core convictions that guides the Ikeda Center's work is the belief that dialogue and mutual understanding are inseparable and needed more than ever. For the center, rather than emphasizing a particular dialogue method or technique, our aim is to promote dialogue that is grounded in a respect for the dignity of life, a firm belief in human potential for good, and for transforming the world, and a clear recognition of the interdependence of all life. We do this through a series of programs, including the development of multi-author books in peace, learning, and dialogue, similar to the new publication, a fellowship program to advance research on a humanistic form of learning called value-creating education, and an annual forum for intercultural dialogue, which we're very fortunate to have been able to partner with Dr. Stearns for our 2015 forum, and a dialogue series for college students and young professionals. These programs are inspired by the firm belief that open-hearted, open-minded dialogue presents humankind with the surest path to peace. Mr. Ikeda, who has written extensively on the role of dialogue in fostering cultures of peace, argues that, quote, "Dialogue is not some simplistic assertion of one's own position, nor is it necessarily about persuading others to one's point of view. Dialogue is about demonstrating respect for another's life and being determined to learn when confronted with differences in personality and perspective." So in today's social and political climate, this message seems all the more timely and pressing. It also resonates deeply with the core themes of this new book. So with that, I'd like to again thank you all for joining us today, and to invite my colleague Mitch Bogan, who worked tirelessly on this book, to share some words on the new publication. So thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank all of you so much. I'm going to overlap with Kevin, I think, now that I've heard his comments. We didn't coordinate, but I believe overlapping is good to reinforce some of these points. But I'll just go ahead. Thank you, George Mason University and the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution for hosting this event. A bonus benefit of working on this project has been to get to know more about the outstanding work of SCAR, the oldest, largest, and most influential program in conflict analysis and resolution in the world. Your program's faculty and students are very impressive indeed. So thank you, SCAR, and also to Dean Avruk for moderating. It's an honor to be sure. And thank you, GMU Press, especially Aaron and Emily, who are here. Thank you for believing in peace building through dialogue and for collaborating with us to create a beautiful and, we think, important book. We are grateful that GMU put their faith in this project. I can't overstate that point. And our sincere thanks to Peter, Susan, and Mark for their excellent and unique contributions to the book. When it came time to invite a scholar to serve as lead editor for the book, we immediately thought of Peter. We knew that his extensive knowledge and experience as an editor, historian, and author would help us to shape a book that could make a strong contribution to the discourse around dialogue. Also, we were delighted to have a chance to work with him on the book, since he is a longtime friend of both Daisaku Ikeda and our center, someone we are glad to call an erudite fellow traveler on the peace-building path. Susan and Mark came to us as recommendations from Peter, and the book is that much stronger for their participation. Their chapters are grounded in hands-on and successful experience with peace-building dialogue, providing a real source of inspiration for our readers. Now I'd like to briefly just share 4 ideas emphasized by Mr. Ikeda that I think can help to illuminate some of the guiding principles of this book. 2 of these are included in his fine foreword. So I recommend any of you who buy the book, first, I recommend you buy it. Secondly, I would recommend reading, not skipping the foreword and Peter's fine introduction. 2 of these ideas, as I said, are in the foreword. The first idea addresses the grave mistake of prejudging and categorizing people in ways that close off opportunities for growth, understanding, and peace. In their chapters, Mark and Susan addressed this matter by pointing to the centrality of relationships of mutual respect in the pursuit of successful peace-building dialogue. Mr. Ikeda explains his perspective in this elegant passage. In order to achieve mutually enriching, deeply connecting dialogue, we need to overcome the divisions within our own hearts that make us unconsciously categorize people and rank their value on that basis. We need to be aware of the danger of categorizing people into such simplistic binaries as good and bad, us and them, and friend and foe. Such an approach is one of the deep drivers of conflict. The second has to do with the prospect and nature of change, a topic also central to Susan and Mark's chapters. A strength of Buddhism is its resistance to the notion of any of us having a fixed identity. In the Lotus Sutra, it is proposed that there are 10 inner worlds, ranging from hunger and anger to learning and realization, all the way up to Buddhahood. Any of these realms, writes Mr. Ikeda, quote, can become manifest at any time through interaction with our surroundings, end quote. Thus in Buddhism, nothing is permanent, and the nature of our engagements with others in our environment can be a determining factor in what emerges at any point. States Mr. Ikeda, ultimately, the teaching of the mutual possession of the 10 worlds encourages us to see others in ourselves, ourselves in others, and to perceive our deeper connections in unity. It is an appreciation of human life as inherently diverse and mutable. It embodies an unwavering faith in the limitless potential and dignity of all people. I am confident that such a perspective offers a path toward peace and harmonious coexistence, embracing all forms of ideological, religious, philosophical differences. The last 2 points are not in the foreword, but they're central to Mr. Ikeda's thinking, and I would like to share them here. I should add that both of these points figure centrally in Peter's introduction and conclusion. The first is the question of idealism and realism. Certainly all of us involved in this work are motivated by strong ideals, but we also suspect that so-called realistic solutions based on coercion never actually succeed in bringing about lasting peace. Mr. Ikeda frames the issue like this. Though engaging in open-hearted and open-minded dialogue may seem to be what he calls the long way around, it is in fact, in the final analysis, the most authentically realistic way to create the necessary foundation for a peace that is more than the temporary absence of violence. The second closely related point has to do with the central concept of Mr. Ikeda's, which he calls human revolution. Section 2 of our book, which looks at the connections between personal and interpersonal transformation, explores the processes involved in human revolution, namely the blending and interdependence of inner and outer peace-oriented change. Mr. Ikeda has described the powerful ramifications of this inner-outer transformation with these words. A great human revolution in just a single individual will enable a change in the destiny of all humankind. We share this conviction, and we hope that this book will contribute to dialogical transformations within both individuals and groups that will move us at least a little bit closer to realizing a world of creative coexistence, the kind of world that the vast majority of people desire to live in, a world in which everyone can realize their unique potential for becoming fully human in the best sense of the word. Again, thanks to all who have contributed to peace building through dialogue. And I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Peter.
Okay, so 4 points very quickly. First of all, it was a privilege to be asked to serve as editor for this book. It enabled me to learn a lot more about dialogue than I knew before. It enabled me to work with some distinguished colleagues, including the 2 authors represented here. And it's always a privilege to work with the Ikeda Center. So my first point is simply thanks. And a particular shout out to Mitch Bogan. Many of you know that doing an edited volume is at points not one of the world's pleasantest tasks. I did some of the lifting, but Mitch did far more, and I'm very grateful to you. You worked hard and you did so very creatively, so thanks. Second point, just brief historical context. It is not surprising to you, but I didn't know this going in, that interest in dialogue fluctuates historically. If you do a Google Ngram, which is one of my favorite little games, if you do a Google Ngram on dialogue, either in the English language or in American English, you'll find that there was a tremendous interest in dialogue as a relative to other interests in the 17th and 18th centuries, understandably given the religious turmoil of that period. But then, literally at the outset of the 19th century, references to dialogue drop off dramatically, and they stay really flat all the way until after World War II. As an historian, I'm interested in the negative proposition. Why was, at least assuming this index is accurate, why was interest in dialogue so low for such a long period of time, at least as explicitly labeled? One obvious factor is in an age of imperialism, when one society believes it has the answers for everybody else, it's not a context in which dialogue is necessarily encouraged. But more relevant to the current project, come 1950, there's a steady ascending curve of references to dialogue, which suggests, I think correctly, A, an increasing realization of need, and B, an increasing capacity. And obviously this volume seeks to build on the need and build on the increasing capacity while contributing to this in turn. So the historical context, and I do a little stuff in the introduction with older contexts as well, but I'll keep it more relevant. Okay? So I find the surge of interest in dialogue and the increasing expertise available very encouraging. And again, our hope is that the book not only expresses this, but encourages its further utilization. Third point is, and this is to some extent already been touched on, the book fairly deliberately explores a tension. On the one hand, and we were very explicit about this, we see the book as contributing to an understanding of the tremendous range of possibilities for dialogue. At some points we were encouraged to narrow the interest, but we deliberately didn't. So obviously there are three principal foci: the role of dialogue in education, the role of dialogue in personal transformation, and the role of dialogue in conflict resolution. And these settings are different, and they invite some different specifics about dialogue, and I think that's a strength of the book overall. But the tension is that while authors disagree on specific definitions of dialogue, they share in all three of the settings. They share a commitment to some of the principles that have already been highlighted. An understanding that dialogue requires respect for others, an understanding that dialogue frequently requires a personal transformation such that you ready yourself for openness and not simply argumentativeness. And I think this tension, the range, but also the common core, is frankly the fundamental framework for the book. And then finally, like everybody, we all hope that this book will contribute to greater knowledge of dialogue, contribute to conversations about dialogue and its multiple applications, and above all, in an obviously challenged contemporary world, serve as a mechanism by which dialogue can be more frequently utilized, more frequently explored, to deal with the many rifts, both domestic and international, that currently concern us.
Thank you. I also want to say my thanks. Mitch, I didn't know you before this process, but I also want to say thank you very much for your gentle handling of my writing and what I was trying to get to, and I appreciate that. It's always lovely to come to GMU. It's such a warm welcome, so thank you. Thank you also, Peter, for your editorship of this great task. So that was all very much appreciated. I don't know many people in the room, but at my part of this book is not actually specifically to talk about dialogue. It's more to do with the comparisons of different dialogue experiences that I have been through. I'm a sort of dialogue mongrel, if you like. I've been through different places, and the four that I pick in the book, although they're not actually the only ones, if you haven't read it yet, is that I'm a priest, and so quite a bit of my time has been spent in priestly sort of rooms, talking to people who have the Christian religion. Secondly, before the job I have now, I was president of the Faith and Politics Institute on Capitol Hill, which is Kevin, you mentioned about trying to bring peace, and I mean, I think I consider myself a complete failure in that respect. In some ways, just looking at the place, it's a remarkable thing. But maybe it would have been worse without us. I don't really know. But so I was trying to bridge divides between Republicans and Democrats under John Lewis's direction. And the third area was that I thought, that is in the book, that I worked for a Buddhist foundation, which is relevant, I think, here. And I was very struck by it. I still am. It provided a kind of pivotal point in my life in many ways. The dialogue I did there, and I'll briefly mention that at the a little bit later. And finally, I'm now running the Sustained Dialogue Institute that Kevin did mention, which is very live right now. It's a certain kind of dialogue. It's much more rigorous than the others. It comes out of Hal Saunders' work. And in fact, the Advanced Party, we're going to Russia in June, and the Advanced Party flew there on Saturday to meet with Secretary Lavrov, who's putting together their team. I mean, it's, and Russia is, you don't have to look very far into the newspaper to realize what a dynamic we're involved with in that circumstance. What do you say? How do you talk? How do you transform anything, including on the American side? We set aside a whole lot of time here with a grant to say, is there something America can actually say to the Russian Federation? Because that's all uncertain right now. Do we have a common viewpoint? But I want to, in terms of changing the paradigm, I want to give you a brief story that isn't an anecdote, that isn't in the book, although it's sort of connected to it. When I was working as a priest, I was a vicar of St. Mark's, Wimbledon, which is the tennis courts. I was very lucky to get that job because I used to play tennis, so it was great. And I had an office, and the office was fairly nondescript, and I would see the people coming from the church there. And I would be wearing the clerical collar and all the black and all that stuff. And I'm also a psychotherapist, which doesn't really show up in the book, but it's yet another piece of my strange mongrel life. And I would see clients as therapy clients, paid clients, in the same room, wearing a suit. And it was remarkable to me that these two different experiences, human beings, just usually two people, not always, mainly, were completely different and quite identifiably similar in that they fell into discrete categories. The priest people tended to want me to tell them what the answer was in some way, what God comes through. In fact, some of that is in the book with a particular story which is rather tragic about a lady who had a miscarriage. The other ones were more interested in this conversation. They wouldn't have called it dialogue, but that's absolutely what it was. And it struck me then, and it still strikes me now, and I'm so grateful for this book giving me the chance to write it out, how that is a humanly created product. It's what we're talking about there, theologically or just in general in a secular setting. What we're talking about with dialogue is a humanly created product. And Hal used to say that all problems are humanly created and they can be humanly uncreated, and that's absolutely right. If we didn't, if India and Pakistan had no people in it, you just have a beautiful landscape instead of the sort of almost near war that we actually have now. It's a human creation. And therefore that's a sort of hopeful point because it means you can change something, because humans can change. And the first sentence in the chapter I write says something like, you can't help but change someone when you talk to them. So you're already doing it. I'm already doing it with you. You're doing it with me just by nodding at me. And gripping on to how you do that is, again, would be a sort of second point that I would like to make that comes out of the story. I'll give you a third one that relates to the story about Buddhism. The organization I worked for was my first paid gig in Buddhism anyway, and I would love to do it again, actually, because it was a fantastic experience. Shinuen Foundation is based in Japan, based in Kyoto and also Tokyo. But they're very strong in Hawaii, deliberately, because it's sort of midway between America and Japan. And their unusual beliefs, it comes out of a master of the Daigoji Temple, some of you may know that place. very ancient Buddhism. And he said there's no Buddhism without volunteerism, which is a little unusual because much of Buddhism is about polishing the Buddha stone and, you know, getting yourself right and the path and the rest of those things. And I am, you know, I sit at the feet of Ikeda Center here for much deeper treatise of that. But he was saying activity is Buddhism, if you like. And they brought young people together for 2 years that I was involved in. Once some Palestinians and Israeli young people. The second one was about Native American from the nations here. And they did it on Waikiki Beach. Not a bad location to have dialogue, I must admit. And you could pretty much wear your swimming trunks and then, you know, do the dialogue and then step over the edge of this wall and go onto the beach and play volleyball. And since time is so short here, the point I think I take from that is twofold. First of all, the Buddhists really had no idea about Israel, almost deliberately, all the Palestinian question, all the things that my organization has wrestled with for decades. Not that I'm the expert on that, we have other people here, but they almost deliberately stuck away from the issues, and they were concerned about the location and the not knowing question. What I think I was struck by was their deliberate desire to not know about the Palestinian question, to not know about the issues that the nations had been through on this piece of land here in the United States. Because by not knowing something, they could address the issue in a sort of fresh way, I guess you'd call it. They probably wouldn't have said it quite that way. I had never thought of dialogue as being that. I always, when someone kind of says we're doing some stuff in Libya right now, so I immediately sort of went to Wikipedia to look at Libya's history. They did the exact opposite. They said, let's not do that. Let's just listen to the people. And I thought that was very striking. And I'll finish with that on the same place, that the location of dialogue is super important, not only for the first story that I was just telling, but for the beach. You can't escape location. You shouldn't want to escape location. And when I was at Faith and Politics, we had all these members of Congress coming down to do the civil rights pilgrimage with Representative Lewis. The plane was a location. It wasn't the formal location, but oh my gosh, it was a location. We would sit people next to each other, Republicans and Democrats. When they walked around in Birmingham or wherever, it was a location, those parks, the 16th Street Baptist Church, the rest of those places. It was absolutely about location. And you would see something, you would talk about those 4 girls who were killed, standing in the basement. And in those moments would be members of Congress who didn't talk to each other, talking to each other. So I will finish there. I mean, those are just little anecdotes and 5 little ideas that I think were fresh to me about how we do dialogue in comparative ways. I hope that's helpful. There's so much more, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well, first, I am honored to have had a piece in this book and enjoyed looking at the book as a whole in preparation for today and seeing the variety of perspectives. So thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mitch, for your careful editing that made my piece much clearer than it started. The piece that I wrote is on peacemaking dialogue. And in that, I put forward some definitions and terminology, looking at what is peacemaking, what is dialogue, looking at difficulties with the track 2 diplomacy term. Track 2 seems to imply that we have track 1 being better and track 2 being lesser. And then the word diplomacy implying that diplomats are engaged in doing this when it's not diplomats, it's a whole variety of other kinds of people and another way of people relating to each other. So in general, what I'm speaking about is any of the range of engagements where people from across conflict divides are speaking with each other, whether it's a civil society-based dialogue, professors and academic-based dialogue, journalists, etc. The whole gamut of society, any of those sectors can engage, whether it's at the elite level or the mid-level or the grassroots level. And so then I look at the terminology of interactive conflict resolution, which Ron Fisher proposed. So having looked at definitions and terminology in the chapter, I won't go into more detail on that piece now, then I look at 5 approaches to peacemaking dialogue. The first one is faith-based dialogue. Then I look at problem-solving workshops, and I'm citing Chris Mitchell in that section. He's in the room here with us. Yes, I cite you. And then I look at psychopolitical dialogue. There I highlight the work of Vamik Volkan. And then sustained dialogue, and I highlight the work of your institute and Hal Saunders. And then training in dialogue, and I look at the Burundi Leadership Training Program and other examples where training has been a context in which dialogue has occurred. So people may not want to say that they're going to talk to those other people, but they get in the same room for a training, and then some of the training exercises create the conditions in which people talk to each other. So training and dialogue. So I want to focus now my comments on 5 key areas where, and this is, Peter mentioned the tension between the variety of approaches, which I just kind of went through 5 various approaches even within peacemaking. And then I turn in the chapter, and this is what I want to share more with you about, is some core characteristics from within this variety of peacemaking approaches. So, a core fundamental thing that I see in all of these approaches for peacemaking dialogue is that dialogues are learning opportunities. And that when people come into a dialogue ready to learn, things work. And when people don't want to learn, that's a difficult thing. So then the trick in a dialogue, if people are not ready to learn, is to create some curiosity. And whether it's curiosity, we can start in different ways. They may not be ready to learn. Your example of the Israeli-Palestinian discussions, someone across that conflict divide may not be interested in knowing the other's political perspective, but maybe we can learn about each other personally. Tell me about your family, or some curiosity on that level. So starting up with the learning opportunity. We may not learn what we want to learn. We may learn things we don't like to hear. We may learn things that make us rethink our own perspectives and positions. Secondly, dialogues engage the moral imagination. John Paul Lederach uses this term in his book, The Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Peacebuilding. With the moral imagination, we are both rooted in our current realities and what we know and what we've come into the room with, and we are open to the other possibilities, and we can envision a different future. And so in dialogues, we engage the moral imagination. I made a little comment here on part of the book I wanted to read to you. The moral imagination requires the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. The ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity. The fundamental belief in and pursuit of the creative act, and the acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the mystery of the unknown that lies beyond the far too familiar landscape of violence. And I'm quoting there from John Paul Lederach, The Moral Imagination book. Okay, so dialogues require that of us, that we must be open to the complexity. It's not yes or no, it's let's explore. There are paradoxes, the curiosity, and then I really like that he highlights this risk of stepping into. We don't know what's going to come out of a dialogue. When I've taught the facilitation course here, I have shared with students my own sense of, I think every time I facilitated a really significant conversation, I've gone in a little nervous because I don't know what's going to happen. And that's a good sign. When I go in not knowing what's going to happen, it means we are open to some possibilities. So that risk piece is a part of it. So dialogues, this is a third point, and as I looked back at the chapter, I wish I could develop this further. What I said in the chapter is that dialogues typically engage impartial outside facilitators. And I think, yes, that's typical, but there are also good things happening with local insider partials who are bridging across conflict divides and serving as facilitators. They are from the conflict communities. They may make pairs of people from across the divide and together co-facilitate. And that's something I would want to add to this. But in the main point being that dialogues engage facilitators, that someone is holding the process. And I'm thinking, for example, when you had the dialogue in the room, whether you're wearing your priestly clothes or you're wearing your psychotherapist clothing, you were holding the process even as you were participating. You were the process person who, in one case or the other, people were either coming to you as a priest or coming to you as a psychotherapist or looking for you to lead the discussion. Someone is responsible for process. Someone is the facilitator of this process, even if they are engaged as a participant. So there's an explicit attention to process in dialogue. Okay, so that's I've done 3 so far. The learning opportunities, moral imagination, and the facilitator. Okay, 4th, and this gets, I think, at one of the key points that Peter noted. 4th is that dialogue honors participants as meaning makers possessing dignity. Everybody counts in a dialogue. Everybody comes in with their own perspective and is given the recognition of you are here and what you say counts to us. We may not agree with you. We may not take on your perspective. We may not plan to do something altogether afterwards, but we're ready to listen. And giving everyone the respect of we will listen to you. Maybe there are time limits. We'll listen to you for 5 minutes. And actually, I should keep a track on that so that you don't listen to me for too much longer. But yeah, there is a fundamental commitment to we will listen to and respect the people who are engaged in the dialogue. And that these people are meaning makers who will make their own meaning out of the dialogue. There is not a sense of you will be told what to think after this dialogue. No. People will make their own meaning out of the discussion. And people will make different meanings because they're coming in with different perspectives, they're hearing it differently, and they'll leave with different things. But the idea with dialogue is that respecting that process and all the different variations which cannot be predicted and outcomes is honoring the human dignity of everybody who's involved. And then finally, the 5th point I make in here is that dialogues can shift focus. There's been a lot written about dialogues which increase understanding. Dialogues such as the problem-solving workshops, which develop some joint analysis or some shared analysis that's informed by multiple perspectives. I add a 3rd one. I've written about it as the catalytic workshop model. It is that dialogues can also lead to planning. Planning some joint activities. And so once you've established the understanding, there can be then some joint analysis of what's needed, what could be done, who could do what, and then move to the planning of, okay, who will do what? Who else do we need to involve? Who's best suited to do this? So in the chapter I give some examples of that. I think that dialogues have given a lot, the dialogue literature has given a lot of emphasis, and probably the dialogue practice world too, has given a lot of emphasis to the understanding and then also to the analysis pieces. I think the practical planning that can end up being generated by a dialogue is also important too. And that's my emphasis on practice matters too, not only the intellectual understanding, but what do people do after the dialogue, and do they have some joint initiatives or some collaboration afterwards, being an important piece of it. And then I do close the chapter with looking at how can we use dialogue more in our world today. In the United States, how can we use dialogue more? And I think there are lots of opportunities for it. Dialogues don't have to be, an 8-week series that meet every week for 3 hours. It can be a short-term thing too, and a learning from each other. We're doing a book discussion here in April. The SCAR community is holding a book discussion where a bunch of us are reading So You Want to Talk About Race, and then we'll have a book discussion. And that's going to be different people bringing in different perspectives of how they read the book and sharing. It's a learning opportunity. We'll be hopefully engaging our moral imagination and seeing the complexities of discussing race in the United States. We will have some facilitators from our community who will be focused on the process more than their own participation. And hopefully we will respect all the participants as meaning makers, and perhaps we'll make some plans from that as what else we can do in engaging diversity in our community. So that's just one example of dialogues. Could be one-offs, which that one will start as anyway. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up to questions and answers, but let me prime the pump. I alluded very briefly to the question that I want to pose to the panel. Like any good and experienced editor, Peter talks about the not limitless, but the very large territory that dialogue can cover, and then in abstracting themes, picks out three that are reflected in the different chapters. One is dialogue in education, in the classroom, in pedagogy. That to me raised the personal question of, well, I can see it in a course in philosophy or history or theology. What would it look like in an engineering course and so forth? The skills have to be taught, and you don't want a range of opinions upon how best to build a bridge necessarily. You want to get down and build the bridge according to the laws of physics. Maybe on aesthetic questions. There are nice bridges and not nice bridges. Dialogue is a matter of personal transformation. And I was thinking here of the classic Bildungsroman, you know, the journey that a young person takes, and the world impedes, challenges, and so forth. And there's change that goes on with some kind of internal dialogue. Interestingly enough, all of us know that some people are more open to internal dialogue than others. Some people are very closed to internal dialogue. And then at the other extreme, some people hear voices. And that's a different form of dialogue. Have to be careful about prophets who hear voices, I think. And the third, of course, is what my colleague Susan Allen specializes in, and that is dialogue as one technique or one set of techniques in the formal world of peacemaking and conflict resolution. And I, not surprisingly, have a lot to say about that, but I won't. What I want to pose to the panel is something I alluded to in my brief remarks, and that is that, of course, in some sense, you can abstract the themes, you can work analytically, but all of these interpenetrate in some way, both as an educational endeavor, as a learning endeavor, as a self-learning endeavor, and then as something that can be used among peoples in some sort of discord, a different way of talking than is bargaining, or even than is formal negotiation. And I'd just like to pose to the panel the point that I alluded to, which is how to elaborate more on this. How do you think these three themes are interpenetrated by the notion of dialogue? Peter, you've thought a lot of it because you were tasked with the introduction and the concluding chapter. So I should either start with you or wait until the others have spoken. Why don't I start with you?
Well, let me, the first challenge you posed that intrigues me is, does dialogue have any place in an engineering curriculum? And I think the answer, frankly, is vigorously yes. Because while there may be some stuff engineers just need to know because it's true, at least for the moment, engineers work with communities. I think the besetting limitation of engineering is the extent to which they don't learn how to participate in dialogic conversations. So the percentage of an engineering class that is organized in terms of dialogue might be slightly smaller than in history, though, by the way, in history there's some stuff they need to know too. But I really think the educate, and as you well know, one of the things that intrigues me about dialogue in education is the extent to which it's one of the oldest known forms of dialogue, and it is so terribly current. I mean, one of the things we're trying to do, obviously, is figure out how more actively to engage students, and that's usually some kind of dialogic process. So the larger question you posed, I'll be brief on it because I mean, I do think, as I tried to say in my brief remarks, I do think the three major sections are connected. Most obviously, the extent to which successful dialogue, even when fairly quickly and informally organized, involves an openness to learning, involves an openness to self-reflection. You're talking personal transformation may sound a little grandiose, but you are talking about a personal openness at least. So I think the connections between the discussions of dialogue as a personal form and the kinds of dialogue that ideally occur in education or conflict situations, I think the connections are very real.
Sure. I'm going to emphasize something that I said earlier, that I'm a practitioner more than an academic. I have done some work in the groves of academia, but not really. So my language and my world comes from the stuff of actually doing. But I actually also want to go back to the bridge, and the laws of physics, which are immutable in some level, some way. If you build a bridge and it's the wrong shape or something, it'll fall off in the middle, fall down in the middle. Or the cathedral that famously in England fell down and killed a lot of people when my dad was living not far away. So you got to. Why am I saying this? Well, because what you're dealing with there is something that cannot be argued with. You build something too long, not strong enough, it'll fall over. It's a sort of immutable law. It is the law of God. Let's just use that word for a second. The reason I'm saying that is because dialogue, I've worked with dialogue and interfaith dialogue quite a bit, and not just in the priesthood setting, but in sort of conflict situations. And many of the fault lines of the world's global conflicts run exactly down the lines of religious difference, and obviously most so in the Middle East. When you are talking to people who have a belief that is infinite, that is an absolute demand on them to have something. Let us say it is evangelical Christians who believe that God, we should all be Christians. So for that matter, the same with Sharia law. I'm very attracted to Islam, and in some ways probably more committed to Islam than I am now to Christianity. But there certainly are absolutes in that faith too. And people who are secular, who tend to go, well, this is my view and what's your view, have a kind of innate difference which is not being bridged. And so I see a kind of connection I'd never made before you said the bridge thing, that there are, in the sense that that's a law of physics and it's immutable, so is that faith thing, which I have noticed. So that's one piece. I don't know if it's how they interpenetrate, but I certainly sort of reflect on that. I also think that we neglect the differences in the power dynamics in dialogue at our peril. We never come into a room at exactly the same spot. And I think to recognize that and to clarify it, even though it can sometimes be painful, to be self-reflexive about it as well, like Peter was saying, is a very important thing. There is no dialogue where two people are exactly the same. There isn't, if we go look in Hanoi right now, you're talking to two people, the differences in some ways couldn't be much starker because they're so unique. But in any dialogue, there is no, even between, like, say, two secretaries of state, there's no exactitude, no exact. So my approach, and certainly SDI's approach, my current gig, is that you have to clarify what it is you're saying, where it is you're coming from, and get as close as you can, sort of pair it out as far. Never going to be the same, but if you said it, it kind of is better. And so those would be just two quick thoughts that I come off your point, and I think it's a very good one.
Thank you. Good question.
Yes.
And also look forward to the other comments. But I want to reiterate the openness to learning and change. And so that when people bring that into dialogue, big things can happen. When people don't, we need to figure out how to shape that and how to encourage that and coax that. And then another thing that I think is a fundamental, and that relates with the education, the human transformation, and the conflict resolution, that openness to learning and change. And then I think another piece that connects across all of that, the education, the human transformation, and the conflict resolution, another intersecting theme is a simple acknowledgement of connection. It's when we take the time to talk with each other in a dialogue setting, that is acknowledging that we're interconnected in some way. And that, I think, is a part of, in education, there's a respect for, we want to learn these things, we want to develop through our education. That's an interconnected sort of acknowledging there are other people out there who thought about these things, other people have studied this, we want to learn from them. That's an acknowledgement of interconnection. The personal transformation is also an openness to some interconnection with others in a way that changes us. Yeah, you're talking to us today, changed me a bit, yeah? And hopefully vice versa. So that openness to connection. Dan Rothbard and I have written about compassion and conflict resolution practice work as systemic compassion. And we have a piece coming out in Conflict Resolution Quarterly in a few months. And that starts with a acknowledging connection and an openness to learning about the other. And then some own personal transformation for the individual who develops compassion for the other. And then that we see as a fundamental piece of conflict resolution. So I will close with compassion as a key theme that fits with all three.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Let me open it up to, I see we have a mic out there, to the audience. Please use the mic, since it is not for amplification, for edification, I hope, but it's also used in our streaming and in our taping. So raise your hand, you'll be recognized. Just say who you are briefly.
Hello, I'm Daniel Rothbard, faculty of SCAR. Congratulations on your book. I look forward to reading it, disseminating it, sharing it, and talking about it in many venues. I want to ask a question about attention in the field of conflict resolution, about the culture question. And the culture question, as you know, emerged some years ago with the accusation that conflict resolution practitioners are kind of like parachuting in with their method, kind of applying it, quickly leaving and so on. Then we have people like Kevin Averick, who basically raised that question at the highest level of reflection. And now there's a strong push in the past number of years for indigenous practices. So that's kind of on the very opposite end of the culture question spectrum, as it were, to really validate indigenous methods, gacaca courts in Africa after Rwanda and many other places, which the gacaca courts, I think, do invite a reflection on our work as whether or not they are the receptivity of the methods that we use with respect to the groups, the conflict parties. So I'd like to just invite that as a question. How do we deal with that tension in the field?
Culture,
Who wants
conflict, Kevin.
Well, yeah. I think along with power, the question of difference, and of course those two really are cross implicated. Along with power differentials, the question of culture, which is to say different communities of speech, different communities of worldview, insofar as they reflect different perceptions of the world, become crucial. So the simplest way to think about a cross-cultural dialogue is, to what extent do we need forms of translation? I think from the simple mechanical one of having a translator there to thinking about deeper issues of what is translatable and what is not. At root, every translation is also an interpretation. And so when we find ourselves in dialogues with parties who are identifiably from different cultures, I think we have to start with the question of what is the quality of the interchanges like, simply in terms of comprehension, understanding? Are people talking and thinking about the same thing? Because often it's when those horizons are not shared that we find people striving for a similar horizon but ending up in the antipodes. So.
I'll comment briefly on that, Dan. The culture question Little story of I had an experience. Chris Mitchell will recognize this. We had a dialogue workshop where virtually 90% of the dialogue happened around breakfast, lunch, and dinner and tea breaks, and very little formal sitting down around the table. And I'd also had training here. This is over 20 years ago. I'd had this training here as a student where I was taught this idea that the break times are actually very important, and make sure you don't rush through that, because all those relationship buildings are a core component, and make sure you've got the ample time for the lunch and the tea and coffee breaks and so forth. So I had in my head these models, and the experience, limited as it was. And then, so 20 years ago, Paula Garb asks me to co-facilitate with her a Georgian Abkhaz dialogue. And Paula Garb is an anthropologist who's worked for decades with the Abkhaz and the Georgians in the South Caucasus region, and she really knows that region well. But she says, I really respect you know these models, and I don't know them. Could you come help me with this? She wanted me to bring the models in. And so we sat down, and this was a really big deal dialogue for these Georgians and Abkhaz. It was the first time they'd had this kind of really in-depth conversation. I had no idea how big a dialogue it was. So I passed her a note, like, we've been talking for 3 hours straight. Shouldn't we take a little break before lunch? Is not for another hour. Because I really think, people, no, they did not want a break. And so what I learned from that is I need an openness to learning as a co-facilitator there, to learn that read the room, ask people, what do you want here? And do that blending of, okay, we brought the model in. The model would suggest you want to take a break sometime between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. when you go to lunch, right? The model would suggest this, but they didn't want to, because this was such a big deal conversation. No one wanted to miss a second of it. The smokers were not taking smoking breaks. It was like nobody needed any of the break time thing because it was such a big deal for them. And so for me, the fundamental thing around the culture question is being open to learning as in that practice moment of we all bring our different models, yes, and then we try to ask and find out what's going to work in this dialogue setting.
And let me just say one thing about the having in some sense contributed to starting this cultural revolution. Warning against over-privileging the indigenous modalities, because indigenous modalities of conflict management, dispute resolution, conflict resolution, always seek to reinscribe the status quo. And the status quo is often about patriarchy, it's often about stratification, it's often about the lack of social justice in a community. So if you go in and say the indigenous forms are all that we need to do, then you'll be doing the opposite of conflict resolution. You will be subverting deep transformation.
I'm Chip House from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and I guess I'm a not visiting, not scholar here. I want to pick up on a point Susan and others have made about the need for respect of the other, and then ask a question to Mark. And the comment is, it took me 45 minutes to get here, walking to the metro, taking the metro, walking here from the metro, and I got to listen to Mr. Cohen's testimony. The lack of respect across the board was amazing. It was the exact opposite of dialogue. But the question for Mark is, as I was reading the book, and especially the first section that deals with Soka Gakkai, about which I didn't know much, my brain moved into faith spaces. And then when I read your chapter and that dialogue with that woman, your congregant, I started thinking about my best dialogue experience over the last 20 years has been with a very conservative evangelical vice president of the Church of England Synod, who you may even know. And Philip and I taught together for 3 years, and we have virtually nothing in common other than we both wear ties, and he believes in what you all call the pastoral support of students. He really believes in student development, which I did as well. And out of that, we have developed a 20-year relationship because we have one thing in common that is very important to us, not the ties. And we've been able to disagree about things like gay clergy, gay marriage, whether or not it is possible to vote for the Labour Party in the UK. And what I'm wondering is if dialogue requires having something, an anchor point to start off with, which could be faith with your congregant, or it could be something else. But I have never really thought about, do you need that hook to build it from?
That's a great question. The story that Chip mentions very briefly, although it isn't even actually in some ways the point of the story, is that I was seeing a woman who came in a bad relationship. The man had already left. She was pregnant by him. We had a series of conversations, dialogues. Then I gave her communion at one point, some months in. Just quite soon after that, the baby died in her womb. And, it was I can feel it choking up in me now. It was a very powerful thing. But she felt that God had invested himself, and it definitely was himself in the child, because that one time she got the bread and the wine. She wasn't religious particularly, but she had no story to attached to it really, and was forever kind of grateful that had happened, and we had done that I had done that. But in some ways, the hook that comes to it is that there was a third person in that dialogue with her, and that was the deity. What I believed about God at that point, what she believed about God at that point, were very different. Did there need to be a connection? Well, I'm not sure we actually have a choice, because there sort of always is. Our humanness requires of us that we connect. Hal was talking about the relationship paradigm to the end of his life. My last conversation with Hal in his house, in his apartment, was about the relationship paradigm. And I think we just simply do have that. There is no point in which, if you're talking to a human being, you've not got a connection. And I actually think that's Buddhism too. I mean, not that I know it well enough. Now, how you deal with that, how you establish where the parameters are, the patterns of interaction that you see in the other person, that they see in you, the power dynamic, the identity framing, the many things that create the form of the interaction is, it's a job for the saint, to use the. I'm feeling awfully religious today. Most of my work is completely secular, but since it came up, is the dialogue is what you make of it, and in many ways the experiences you've had and your history makes it good or makes it bad. But I'm not sure that I think that there's a possibility to have a dialogue where you haven't got that initial hook, because there sort of always is. But I don't know whether you all would agree or disagree. That'd be my take.
I think there's work to do before dialogues when people aren't ready to engage.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that would have been my reaction. That if you get people into, even whether it's called dialogue or not, into an interaction situation, they've implicitly, at least for the moment, they've reached an agreement that they share humanness.
Yes.
I mean, the bigger problem we face is when you can't figure out how to get them into that connection in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's one of the invitations that I think a book like this offers. There is knowledge of how to do this. We don't know enough about how to get people into the process who aren't sort of somehow previously motivated. The prior learning that precedes dialogue.
Right.
The problem is that the recognition of shared humanity, which is in all too short a supply, but the recognition of shared humanity is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for true conflict resolution to take place. Israelis and Palestinians who have been in various forms of dialogue for for years, know each other very well, know their families, celebrate their children's birthdays and marriages. For that group, there is no lack of recognition, but there are structural issues. There are issues that I think dialogue always strives to address. One of the critiques of dialogue is that for all its attractiveness, for all its positivity, it is less successful at addressing some of the structural issues that characterize so many of the deeply rooted conflicts that we know about. Issues like patriarchy, issues like class or caste. So recognition necessary, but alas, not sufficient. And it's how one moves levels. You know, as
Yeah.
you become more metaphorically religious, I become less so, I have to say.
Good.
So
That's probably
it's
better.
how the electron jumps levels to another level and gives off light and heat. How we accomplish that. You know, metaphorically there, we accomplish it by sending a neuron into the damn thing really fast and breaking it up, which is really the question of whether or not that kind of change doesn't require some kind of dialogue, but some kind of revolutionary change. And since you have written on that, I wonder if you could address that. You did that marvelous world history of peace and of tolerance. What have you learned from taking the world historical view of this?
I don't know that I have a quick response. I mean, the obvious point in the tolerance study is that history teaches us, first, that tolerance is very difficult, but second, that it occurs in more cultural settings than we in the West sometimes acknowledge, which is, so the first point is discouraging, the second point encouraging.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be able to learn to deal with other people's tolerance traditions without necessarily accepting them fully, but as a bridge that can be built upon.
Thank you. I have to say one of the most intriguing things in your intriguing introduction was when you did the Google
Right.
engram, and it turns out that interest or commitment to dialogue rises in the 17th, 18th, and falls in the 19th, and you intriguingly related that perhaps to the great misadventures of imperialism and world conquest. And when you're busy being an imperialist and giving orders and being commanding, that your attraction to dialogue is probably going to be at a very low
Right.
end.
Dialogue also, there's no engram for this. Dialogue also declined with the advent of Christianity in the West. Christians pretended to do dialogue for a while in the early Middle Ages, but their scenes were always fake. And then after a bit, they lost interest. Because if you know the truth, you don't dialogue.
Right.
That's true. And perhaps we should also recall that, at least historically, one of the great advocates of dialogue in the classroom or in the peripatetic was Socrates, and he was forced to drink hemlock. So this is dangerous work that we're embarking in.
Chris Mitchell, I'm emeritus professor. A comment for Kevin about engineers, and then a question which is mainly about to Mark, something that Mark said. But I once, for my sins, had to teach a course on political decision making to a set of aero engineers, and they were not the slightest bit interested in this sort of vague, airy-fairy stuff. And the only way I could get across to them is to say to them something like, listen, in 10 years' time, you're going to be middle management. You're not going to be doing engineering. You're going to be dealing with human beings, and you better start thinking think a little bit ahead. But that sort of broke the wall down a little. Thank God it was only a five-class course. Mark, and maybe I guess the rest of the panel, think a bit more about location, and why it's important, and how you get people into a location where I think my experience has been people change depending on where they are.
Absolutely.
And where they're actually interacting, and where they're perhaps in a location where they're a bit uncertain about what's happening to them, what they should do. So is your impression somewhat similar to mine, that location matters a lot? And if it does matter a lot, how do you drag people kicking and screaming out of their comfort zone into an interesting and challenging location?
That's really
dialogue.
That's absolutely what I think, Chris. And I gave sort of something of an example. But I mean, just to go back to the Russia piece, we gave at the end of a year ago or so, when we were actually in Moscow, the end of the dialogue there, Dartmouth dialogue, we were invited to address the Russian Senate House, or at least a sort of committee room of the Russian Senate House, with some fairly significant people on the other side of the table, including the former ambassador here, who got hoiked out because he talked too much to Trump, basically. He was there, and some others. And this room was exactly as I've got photographs of it, as you imagine Russian-American dialogues. Down the middle it had the flags, and it had a straight square table, and Jim Collins, the former ambassador on our side, leader of the dialogue, was in the middle, was placed, there was no choice about that. Whereas in Dartmouth, we are careful to place people, we have a hollow square, but we make sure Russians go around with Americans and all sorts of things. So, and what we had in that conversation was a stodgy inability, an inability to have the conversation. Days before, and this is partly in that book, because it came out at the same event, we were at Zavidovo, the former Dacha of President Brezhnev, beautiful place with it has this fantastic landing for this boat that he had. He shot these bears off the boat. He was a man. He was something else. I read more about him once I saw his house. Anyway, and the landing dock is glorious. It has these white curtains. It still has them. I mean, and it's this carved wood, and there are these people, when we were there, like offering this scented tea. I mean, it was something else. And it was all kind of similar to how he had it way back when. And the conversation there with the same people was this kind of enlightened, we get it, we understand you, we hear you. So not only is, in some ways there's no absolute way of doing this, because every situation is different, and I believe that every person is different in every circumstance. But insofar as you could sort of tell, it was remarkable the difference that made in the same trip. And I mean, we went down the thing in a boat, and it's the same. So yes, in fact, when I was at Faith and Politics, we actually documented it, that we considered the dialogues, this is Republican-Democrat dialogues in Alabama, which weren't in the room, as more important than the ones that were. When we went on those civil rights pilgrimages, those were the more important ones than that we did in the formal settings. And so, all I would say in this short space is to very much focus, if you are doing dialogue, on the space and where you're doing it, and drag them kicking and screaming, whatever you want to do, or at least notice the differences. So yes, those are my two little anecdotes about that.
I'll add, if I may, Point of View. Andrea Bartoli had a group of people at Point of View, and they were from various sides of a conflict, and they said to him, "This is a place you cannot help but make peace." And that's a location that has a really special atmosphere to it.
Diane Perlman, visiting scholar here, also a psychologist for social responsibility, Mediators Beyond Borders, and Abolition 2000. And my question is about levels and global level, and also, specifically what I want to ask about is applying this to the UN Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, or PrepCon, that I'm going to in a few months. And just speaking about location, I wrote a piece when it fell apart, I think after 2005 NPT, called Nuclear Theater of the Absurd, saying instead of in the basement of the UN without windows, what if we all met in a retreat center with massages and children and food? So that the process would be different. So my question is about applying this. That I often go to the nuclear nonproliferation every time it's been in New York since 2000. So over the years, there's been increasing dialogue between the delegates, and there are lots and lots of NGOs from all different kinds of organizations. And so there's increasing dialogue between the NGOs and the delegates, but there's also conflict between the nuclear weapon states, specifically the U.S., and things always fall apart over Israel and the conference on the Middle East. So I have lots of different questions about different levels, but I thought I would start with this one. If you see how you see any application to this, and also as my role is evolving in the network, one initiative that I want to develop now that a lot of the NGOs are focused on eliminating the weapons themselves. And a year and a half ago, we had the nuclear ban treaty for which the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded. But that's about to the group that I was also involved with, and I was at that. They're all focused on eliminating the weapons, and I want to try to. And they had a big initiative on humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and all the terrible things, which are all important and true. But I want to work on the causes and the underlying conflict and start to develop an initiative there. So how do you see your work applying on this level?
As I listened to you, I thought about your question, particularly around what to do with the nonproliferation conference and the preparations you're doing, and it sounds like there's a plan to meet in a basement windowless room.
No. All of the UN
and you're
conference rooms, they're all in.
And you're involved in one of these, or
underground.
Okay.
And
So in terms of if you're looking for suggestions on. One of the things I comment on in the chapter I wrote here is Sarah Cobb speaks about the conflict resolution engagement as creating a sacred space. So that gets to location again, and that I think yes, it's great when we're at point of view and we've got the woods and the water and this beautiful nature and lots of windows and walking outside and being inside, and that kind of naturally creates a sacred space for discussions. But I think even a basement conference room with no windows, we can create an intentionality around, do some care with some, tea and coffee and welcoming people to the space, or do some ways to make it a location that becomes marked as, okay, we are here for this conversation now. And great if we can throw in the view too, but that's not always possible. So yeah, at different levels, I think dialogue, I participated in the U.S.-Russia dialogue that Sustained Dialogue Institute has led with their Russian counterparts, and very senior officials can be very informal in the right location. Yeah. And so we've been at those beautiful places for some of those. Pardon?
Were you at Zabidova that day?
No, I stopped participating just as you started. Yeah, but you came to my family's home in in Maine, where we hosted some of the U.S.-Russian dialogue participants. And so that beautiful place with water, and it makes a special place for discussion. Yeah, it's just as you were starting at Sustained Dialogue.
I have this image now of it's a dreadful image of Donald J. Trump and Kim Jong-un playing basketball, volleyball on a beach in Waikiki. Yeah. Maybe it would help, maybe it would help. Or maybe we don't want it like that. I mean, actually, it's kind of interesting. I'm only partially joking. I mean, would it be different? But the thing about that, of course, is that in some ways, he's the very person we do not want to take out to a place which is all free and let's all think what thoughts we can. I mean, I'm talking about our president, crazily enough. For him, you want the straitjacket of the square room to sort of calm him down. So there's one interesting thing is the sort of self-reflexivity of this. It goes both ways. You can influence it in different ways, and who you're talking to, and who it might work the other way. We're always assuming we want to be sort of free and take all our clothes off and be nice, but it might not be that way.
Stop there once you put that image.
I'm sorry.
There are certain things.
The two of them together, like
you can't unsee them. So we have room, time for another. Yes, please.
My name's Mary Morris. I was wondering if you could say what might be new, fresh, different from the books already on peace building and dialogue that are out there, and how do you hope this book will be used?
Well, let me start by saying, in general, the field's approaches to peace building and peacemaking has undergone many different stages of evolution. I would say in the beginning, particularly in the post-World War II era, 1950s, particularly in the United States, out of a group working out of the University of Michigan, under the terror of mutually assured destruction, there was a great emphasis put upon game theory, upon behaviorist approaches, upon heavily cognitive or cognized approaches to what are the optimal ways in which you bargain or negotiate and so forth. And there was a lot of head and very little heart. And even the head was often not screwed on right, but there was certainly a lot of head and very little heart. And one of the ways in which our field has moved is to pay a lot more attention not only to affect and to emotions and to the cultural differences in how affect is processed and so forth, but to let heart and maybe even soul, but certainly heart, into our, I shouldn't say the word toolkit, because that brings us back to a different metaphor, right? Into our conception of what peace building could look like. And to me, dialogue fits very, very much in that revolutionary, evolutionary thinking about what the field is, where you are not simply interested in getting to yes, but in a sense in dialogue, it's two parties getting to which is very different.
I think that's a great way to finish, getting to huh.
Okay.
And then we can get to cake.
Getting to let's have one more, because I can't resist having one more. I don't want to end it on getting to That doesn't sound like the deep thinking of a dean, you know? So let's. Yeah. Please.
Hi. I was waiting for the book like a month ago of monitoring Amazon, and I got it a month ago as soon as I saw it's available to purchase. Thank you for such a wonderful book. And I read Peter's opening and closing part. Susan, I will definitely read Mark's chapter. I have a question for panelists and a question for Peter. By the way, I'm Sarah. I'm in SCAR working in focusing on dialogue. I work on a model of digital dialogue named Reflective Digital Dialogue. And I was so challenged for literature on, that's a question to Mark. I was so challenged during my research for literature and practice on online dialogue. So I was hoping that in a 2019 book, I will see something about it, and I read something that we find through library research or Google, Ingram, everything. They are all social media dialogue, that they are not like systematic, structured dialogue that we practice it in SCAR or in the academic area. Do you think now that new generation, new practitioners are focusing on online dialogue, do you think this part will be applied to the publication, to attention, that what are, for example, we have question, if face-to-face dialogue practitioners sit with online dialogue practitioners, how they exchange the different experiences, the outcomes, the results. And my question to panelists is that if you want to define dialogue in one sentence, that it's differentiated from negotiation, facilitation, other approach of intervention, what sentence do you use? Thank you.
Well, first of all, obviously, great question. It would have been an interesting thing to entertain. So I'm sorry we didn't have the question a few years ago. Would have been good. Look, I don't have a lot to offer except the obvious points that online dialogue certainly can have some of the characteristics that we know inform successful dialogues in more conventional settings. But we also know from the current exploration of the limitations of social media, we also know that the absence of person-to-person, literally face-to-face contact is something that is going to take much more serious attention than we probably would have thought 5 years ago. So I don't mean that, so I think it's a great topic area, deserves attention, but I think we also want to make sure we recognize that online dialogue needs to provide some opportunities for personal exchange and acquaintance of the sort that's going to occur in the coffee break, et cetera, in a more conventional setting. And I think that would be really interesting to explore in some ongoing case studies.
So look forward to Sahar's dissertation defense
Exactly.
coming up in a few weeks.
Let me invite everyone to continue their own dialogues. Let me thank the panel, and let me thank Mitch and Kevin from Ikeda for your support over the years and these kinds of world-transforming processes. Let me thank also our colleagues from the George Mason University Press who worked so hard to make this very beautiful book, actually a very beautiful book possible. Yeah. And to remind you that our colleague Stu is sitting back there from the University Bookstore, and I'm sure the authors will be willing to inscribe your copies for you here. So thank you all, and please let us now repair.